Okay, good morning. It's good to see you. My name is Robert Viscusi. I'm the chair of the planning committee for this visit of the Robert L. Hess Scholar in Residence. You all have a copy of this program. The history of this event, this week-long event, is outlined on the inside front cover, and I recommend to you that you read it. We do it in memory of Robert Hess, who came to this college in 1979, when the college was in really very bad shape for various reasons, not worth going into now. And he really just changed the whole atmosphere here and restored the college to something of the kind of self-confidence and pride in its mission that it had from the beginning. This is a school that has produced a lot of very successful writers, economists, doctors, lawyers. I don't know if we have any Nobel Prize winners just yet, but we're getting there. We're closing in on it. Every other year, it turns out, we invite, sometimes every year, we invite a distinguished practitioner of one of the scholarly arts, a writer, a film director, an historian, a professor of environmental studies and sustainability, professor of women's studies. These are some of the categories of people who have come. And our visitors speak to a wide variety of students and faculty over the course of the week's visit. The visit is packed kind of tight, as you'll see when you look at the schedule. There's 2, 3, even 4 events on each of the days. This morning, I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Lauren Mancia, Barbara Nevins-Taylor, and Jessica Siegel for coming with their classes. Our guest, Thomas Frank, is a hard writer to categorize. He has a PhD. He writes history, he writes political analysis, he writes journalism, and he is, more than anything else, disturbing and full of surprises. Not disturbed, but disturbing. And he has a genius for asking the right question. He first came, he appeared on my horizon and that of a lot of other intellectuals, I think, about 10 years ago when he published a book called What's the Matter with Kansas?, which asked the question, why is it that the poorest county in Kansas, one of the poorest counties in the whole country, in the year 2000 had voted 80% for the Republican candidate for president? It was George Bush, you remember him. George W. Bush, or as they call him in his family, 43. Not referring to his IQ, but in the early pages of this book, he quotes his sister-in-law as saying that she couldn't understand. She had grown up not believing that it was possible for someone who worked for a boss to vote for a Republican. Because really, lots of people, myself included, growing up, when we grew up, the Republican Party was the party of the bosses, period. Everybody else voted Democratic or socialist or communist or labor or something. It's a brilliant book about the change in political culture in the United States that first stuck its head above water in the 2000 election and became really, really very disturbing by the end of the decade. He's written quite a number of books, and he's still writing very interesting things. I'm not going to tell you about any of those things because I don't want to talk anymore. I would rather give you, it's my great pleasure and honor to give you Thomas Frank.
Well, howdy, folks. So I am from Kansas, and that's the way we talk. So from Kansas to Brooklyn. Actually, in between, I lived in Chicago for many years, and Brooklyn looks like a little tiny Chicago to me. That's what I. Is that a fair comparison? Do you think? Is it? No. All right. So, yeah. What should I tell you? I come from Kansas City originally. Decided at a very early age that I wanted to be a historian, but I wanted to do a specific kind of history. I wanted to write the kind of history that's not you don't see much of anymore. Y'all know who Richard Hofstadter is? Yeah. So he's wait, but you're the professor. Of course you. So when Richard Hofstadter was, the sort of, or Arthur Schlesinger, any of these guys, that was the kind of historian I wanted to be, that wrote books for a general audience that were still scholarly rigor, I was going to use scholarly as an adverb. Okay, that's impossible. But that were accountable and rigorous and, books that could be taken seriously as scholarship and also be bestsellers, also be read by millions and millions of average book readers. And Hofstadter in particular always appealed to me because he's so counterintuitive. He was forever coming up with some. You guys should read him if you don't know who I'm talking about. He was forever coming up with some upside down explanation for things that were going on. And he wrote among other things, he wrote a great book called The Age of Reform. It's about a very similar subject to What's the Matter with Kansas, only we come to opposite conclusions. But it's a book about the populist era and the progressive era, which are things that happened 100 years ago. Anyhow, I was always fascinated by this, so I had to study history, right? I had to go and get a graduate degree in history. But doing that kind of history in academia that's tough nowadays. As you guys probably know, what you focus on when you get a PhD and become a professional historian, what you focus on now is doing much more, how should I put this, closely focused, writing much more closely focused works, not these sort of general sprawling things like, think of Arthur Schlesinger writing The Age of Jackson, this enormous book about all sorts of things. And that's really not what academics do anymore. I mean, you can do that once you're very senior in the profession, but you certainly can't do that starting out. So it's a funny thing. So I went and got a PhD in history at the University of Chicago. I studied American history, cultural and intellectual history. That's what I wanted to do. Not political history. I wasn't really interested in that. I just sort of wandered into that by mistake. But I wanted to do cultural and intellectual history. And this is in the pre-internet era. Do you want to hear what I wrote my dissertation on? You'd probably find this amusing. So I wrote it about the advertising industry in the 1950s and 1960s. And to do the research for that, like say you wanted to see old advertisements from the 50s and 60s, it was not easy in those days. You couldn't just dial up YouTube, right, and look at them. I had to go around to museums around the country where the actual, videotapes of these ads were stored, and then persuade them to let me look at them and this kind of thing. It was not easy. Anyhow, so coming straight out of graduate school, I got a job. This is the mid-90s. I got a job, and it was the same situation then as prevails now, which is it's pretty tough to get a job in academia. And I wound up doing adjunct work in colleges in Chicago, Illinois. And what I discovered right away, do you know what this is, an adjunct? So this is, okay. I discovered right away I could earn more from writing a single newspaper story than I could for an entire semester of teaching history, which sounds like really cold and calculating and kind of insane, but is nonetheless was true at the time. So I quit academia to do journalism because of the money. Yeah, sorry. Anyhow, it's just, it's an incredible step in the wrong direction. Like, why would anyone do such a thing? I mean, because, of course, journalism immediately after that just completely collapsed. And today, it's, basically the internet driving the price of journalistic labor down and down and down. That's a field where the time is not that far off when you have to pay them to publish your material or something like that, It's already one of the, well, we'll get to that in a minute. But so I started writing for the Chicago Reader, and I would write sort of snide cultural pieces about, and this is something that might be of interest to y'all here in Brooklyn. What the Chicago Reader is, or it was part of there used to be independent news weeklies in every city in America. A lot of them are gone now, but they were all patterned after the Village Voice, and the Chicago Reader was one of the oldest and most successful of them. And their idea for me was that I would go around making fun of hip capitalism. Okay, like so some guy's opening a restaurant that has a lot of like pseudo-political crap on the walls, right? And I would go there and mock it, or some kind of foodie artisanal thing, and I would make fun of it in a really savage way in the newspaper. This is what I did, and it was strangely more popular than you might think. And from one thing led to another, and I started writing for Harper's Magazine and other outlets, and also wrote books at the same time. And I wrote, as Bob said, I wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, and then the strangest thing happened. One day, I get a call from the editor of the Wall Street Journal, or the editor of the opinion page of the Wall Street Journal. This is in 2008, so we've gone quite a ways here. And they wanted to hire me to be a columnist at the Wall Street Journal, an op-ed columnist at the biggest circulation newspaper in America. This was kind of a surprise. It's a very conservative opinion page, and I'm really liberal. Okay, despite how I'm dressed. Okay, that's but of course, I took a chance, and it was because it's a great opportunity, biggest newspaper in America, and that's something that you guys are going to want to hear about. That was a very it's a very difficult work. I had to write a column every week. 800 words, and it had to be right on the nose, exactly 800, maybe off by 3, but not much more than that. Every week had to be turned in exactly on time, and I couldn't screw it up, and everything had to be checked, by the way. They didn't have time, there's no time to check it before it went out to be printed, or to check it thoroughly. I mean, the editor would obviously, if something struck him as iffy, he would ask me about it. But everything had to be perfectly in order and ready to go. Especially since this is a newspaper whose audience didn't really appreciate my point of view, and so they would be naturally very critical of what I had to say, and so I couldn't make any mistakes, and it was very hard work. Yeah. Yes, and then at some point I got sick of that for reasons we can talk about later, and went on to Harper's Magazine. Okay, and here the column was a monthly deal, right? And it was 2,000 some words, and essentially print only. Okay, but here everything was very closely edited, layers of fact checking, not just one, but on and on. Very professionally edited. The piece would finally be printed. It would be this shining, brilliant, polished thing that just absolutely gleams with genius and wit, and that's what they deal in at Harper's Magazine. And eventually I got sick of that too. And now I'm at or I was at Salon.com, which is now I'm completely on the internet. You can't even find me in print anymore. And I'm taking a leave of absence from them right now to write another book, because that's I still imagine my main occupation as doing this kind of public-minded history in the way that Hofstadter did, or in the way that Arthur Schlesinger did. That's still my idea of what I want to be doing with myself, even though, unfortunately, I suppose, or maybe fortunately, over the years, it's the way that my style has developed. I don't write this kind of academic style history anymore, but instead far more polemical, and even politicized. Yes, politicized, even biased, sort of books, and that's what I do with myself. And so over the years, I've written. How many books have I written? 5? I think I've written 5 and edited 3. Lots and lots of them. And I'm working on another one right now. And we'll talk about all that in a minute. You want to know what the books were about? You guys interested in that? So the first one, here's how it all developed. It's kind of an interesting story. So I told you I wrote a book about advertising. You know, kind of a fascinating subject, but also like who would be interested in the advertising industry in the 50s and 60s? I mean, you talk about abstract and like difficult and long ago and totally forgotten. I mean, it's not like they've ever made a TV show about this period or anything, right? It's a joke, folks. So I wrote this book, and it among other things, it woke me up to something that's probably very obvious to you guys, which is that we live in a commercial culture, and that culture isn't just something that we all get to go out there and participate in and make, but it's something that is bought and paid for and constructed by an enormous industry that happens to be headquartered right here in New York City. And it's kind of a roundabout way to understand what capitalism is, but nevertheless, that's what happened. And I started to figure this out. It is a strange way now that I think back on it. But so my next book was about business culture in the 1990s, which also sounds really dry and boring. But do you all remember this idea of the new economy? Do you remember this back in the 90s? And it was supposed to be the laws of economics had suddenly been repealed, and we were living in this new era when, the NASDAQ had, we were just talking about this earlier, NASDAQ went up to 5,000, Bill Clinton was in the White House, and it was as though, the sun was, the morning was dawning, and the economic world had turned a corner, and it was nothing but glorious prosperity from here to eternity. And then, and there was this incredible outpouring. It really was a kind of springtime for Wall Street. And there was this unbelievable outpouring of, I guess you would say, propaganda of, where the business world was explaining itself as, well, anyhow, I'm not doing it justice. It's hard to. Shit, it shouldn't be hard to explain. It's like I wrote hundreds of pages on it. But it was springtime for the profit motive. Let's put it that way. And I had a great time. It was just like, it's what they call in the military a target-rich environment, It was just like you turn on the TV and here's something you can easily mock. And it was just one after another after another. I had that VCR going all the time. I taped CNBC on the day the NASDAQ crashed. I was taping it all the time. We all knew it was going to crash, right? And it had to at some point, and I was taping it all the time. It was anyhow great fun. But then, people like me sit around and look at this, this crazy system that we live under, this political and this economic system, and wonder why we don't have more of an adversarial culture. Why we don't have a politics that is more critical of it all. And as Bob mentioned, we used to in this country. I mean, you go back to, well, hell, you go back to the 1890s or the 1930s, and you had a political culture that was deeply critical of capitalism. Yes, right here in America. And my home state of Kansas was essentially governed by radicals, people that we would call socialists today. In fact, a lot of them later on became socialists. And you had this all over America. And it's that tradition is completely gone today. And so as I watched the new economy crumble and all of these wonderful promises of, glorious prosperity forevermore, all of these promises fall apart. I wondered why we didn't see the same kind of reaction that we did in the 1930s or in the 1890s. When hard times comes, this is what happens. You get you get the bonus marchers descending on Washington, D.C., or you get populists taking over the state capitol in Topeka, or something like that. None of that happened. And so I wondered why, where does this kind of, when you study working class culture in America today, you find that it's often associated with political conservatism. Now, why is that? And so that's where What's the Matter with Kansas came from. And I decided to write about that at the state level in my home state of Kansas. And what else did I write? Well, it doesn't really matter. Then I wrote a book about corruption in Washington, which is a fun, hilarious subject. Great fun. Y'all know who Jack Abramoff is? You ever heard of this character? So when I moved to Washington in the mid-aughts, Jack Abramoff was this lobbyist who was this high-flying, they called him a super lobbyist. And he later turned out he'd been defrauding his own clients, you know, and ripping them off in these fantastic ways and doing all these other crazy things in Washington, D.C. And he was very conservative, deeply conservative, closely aligned with the Bush administration. And what intrigued me about him was that he was both corrupt and idealistic at the same time. That's really interesting. So I wrote a whole book about that and how you can have corruption and idealism at the same time. And then I also wrote a book about the Tea Party movement, which I understand your professors have kindly asked you to read, right? Is that right? Yes? No? Okay. So I hung around with a lot of Tea Party people. Okay, that doesn't really matter, but I did. I went to a whole lot of Tea Party rallies. You didn't have, you know, Brooklyn was kind of a hotbed for that sort of thing, right? A lot of that Tea Party activism in Brooklyn. No?
No? This group read your essay on the 60s.
Oh, okay. So,
Pieces of Conquest of Cool.
Conquest of Cool. Okay. 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 Oh God, you know how old I was when I wrote that? I was like 27. I turned 50 the other day. I know. Yeah, now I have to wear a tie all the time. That's the law. That's the law. Okay, so let's talk. Well, let's blab. What do you want to ask me?
So I'm going to ask you your first question.
Okay.
Okay. So we have, just so all the students also know who's sitting next to you, right? We have a whole bunch of journalists, and then we have a whole bunch of historians, right? Or journalists in training, and then historians in training, right? So it seems like we're sort of representing different aspects of Dr. Frank's life, right? Where one aspect is his sort of training as a
No,
historian.
I'm not Dr. Frank. I mean, I have a PhD, but don't.
Mr. Frank,
Yeah.
right. Excuse me. That's my bias as a historian, right? You need a license to practice history in my but so one is his PhD in history, is his training as a historian, and the other is his role as a journalist and the way that he writes history as a journalist, right? So we have his journalists in training. You know, something that you guys can think about is, you know, how Mr. Frank sources information, right? How he researches when he's writing his articles, like what his writing process is like, right? You guys, I'm sure, have a host of questions methodologically that you're interested in, and our historians also have questions methodologically, right? Sources to a journalist are different from sources to a historian, right? So think about those questions, because I'm going to ask you to ask questions now, right? And I will ask my first question. So, I'm interested in the fact that you're writing history of the present, right? So a lot of times historians want history to be old so that there's enough distance so that you can diagnose your own bias.
That's right. That's right.
And so I'm interested in what you...
Recent history. It's a problem.
Exactly. So, you know, you
It is
also have like the longevity of your career to reflect on earlier things that you wrote. So I'm interested in, you know...
The longevity of my career. Good Lord. I am 50. I did turn 50 the other day. Well, it's funny. So when I was... So my first book, The Conquest of Cool, this is my dissertation as a graduate student. And I remember my advisor at the time saying, you know, have we gone far enough so that we can talk about the 60s now? I mean, is it now possible to write histories of the 60s? That was in the 90s. And I guess it was possible. You know, what else? You know, we got to write about it at some point or other. I mean, everybody writes histories of the 60s now. Recent history, well, it's tough. Because of course you can't take the biases out. You can't, you know. And the way I deal with that is just I admit them up front. You know, there's no other way. But okay. So let me just tell you something I'm working on right now. I've been writing about the Clinton administration, history of the 1990s. Now I wrote about the 1990s a lot when they were happening, as I mentioned earlier. But there's also you know, a huge amount that it looks very different now from, what are we, 20 years on. Okay, so I went to the Clinton Library a while ago, the Clinton Presidential Library. If something is in a museum, you're allowed to write about it as a historian. That's my rule, okay? Well, no. Look, I also do journalism, so I can write about whatever I want. It doesn't matter. But Bill Clinton has built a monument to himself, an extravagant one, funded by all these people who are his donors. He's built this extravagant museum of his own administration, and it's naturally very flattering to Bill Clinton. So it is totally fair game. But it's interesting, as I go back and read accounts of his administration written at the time or written right after the time, the sort of political journalism that everybody does in Washington, D.C., there is so much that we forget about the 1990s. There are things that were not important then that are important now. I'll give you an example. Y'all remember the crime bill of 1994? Nobody remembers this. Anybody remember it? Have you ever heard the term mass incarceration? Yes. I mean, this is something that years ago I studied apartheid South Africa. They had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If we ever have that in this country, we've got a lot of politicians that are going to have to answer for why they have locked up so many millions of Americans for things that should be just a matter of getting a fine or getting probation or just something small, and they're in prison, and a lot of them stay in prison all their lives. And one of the reasons for that is the 1994 crime bill, which Bill Clinton proposed, got through Congress, and then signed. Had all sorts of awful provisions. They had this great idea called 3 strikes, you're out. They had this other great idea called a mandatory minimum, which they extended to everything. They had another great idea, which was this actually was in the law already, it was in American law, which was to treat crack as being 100 times, to sentence it, I'm going to get this confused. They call it the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity. Crack is made of cocaine, okay, but cocaine, let's say you're caught with an ounce of cocaine, you get X sentence. If you're caught with an ounce of crack, you get 100 times that. That was the law then. And it was the law, but had been written, and they didn't really know what they were doing, and so it came up, and the 94 crime bill kicked it over to what's called the U.S. Sentencing Commission and said, whatever they decide is what we'll deal with. And the Sentencing Commission studied it and said, this is ridiculous, we've got to do away with this. It's putting a whole generation of young people in prison. And this has to be ended right now. It was obviously racist. It had obviously the results of it were so patently racist that the law itself basically had to go. And what did Bill Clinton do? He got Congress that would have become the law of the land. Bill Clinton went out of his way to get Congress to overturn that and signed it to make sure that stayed, that the 100-to-1 sentencing disparity remained the law. Nobody remembers this. This was 1994 and 1995, and there are millions of people in prison because of that. I'm sorry, how did I get off on this tangent? That's because that's history. So if you go back and read accounts of the Clinton administration, it's all about the sex scandals. I mean, almost all. That's what they cared about. But you look at this, and you're like, oh my God, he did that? Or the deregulation of Wall Street. When this happened, nobody remembers this anymore. Well, we remember it now because it seems more important now. But Clinton and his team deregulated the financial industry, a series of deregulations. They deregulated interstate banking in 1994, and they were very proud of themselves. They said, Reagan couldn't get it done, Bush couldn't get it done, but we got it done. And then they went on and they deregulated it more. In 1999, they overturned a law from the 1930s called the Glass-Steagall Act. This is very important. The Glass-Steagall Act had established the structure of the American banking industry. When Roosevelt was president, they used to do things like that, right? And they overturned it. It's gone. So all of a sudden, Travelers merges with Citibank. This merges with that. You've got these enormous, too-big-to-fail institutions. AIG comes along. Is it an insurance company? Is it a hedge fund? Who the hell knows? All of this is made possible by them overturning that law. And when they overturned it, basically nobody was against it. One senator, maybe two. And Clinton and his team were like, this is a no-brainer. This is of course we're going to do this. And they had a big celebration. Today, it looks very different. In hindsight, this was this was a terrible thing to do. Okay, so I'm sorry, that's a long-winded answer. That's far more than you wanted. But that's, recent history is in some ways the most fun history. And the internet has really changed the way you do it. So when I used to write about these things, you had to dig in archives. doing more recent history. So Clinton's every remark is essentially available online. You can't get at his the memos that his aides sent back and forth to one another, but you can get at everything he said. You can watch the videotape of him signing the '94 crime bill and the speech that he gave afterwards. He's very proud of himself. All this is available now. It's made it much easier to write about, which is a great thing. It's also a terrible thing. The internet is also making it impossible to earn a living, you know. But it's making the research easier. Okay, I talk too much. I'm sorry.
These folks are interested in process, journalism process.
Okay.
And your storytelling. So anybody over here? Ashley?
Yeah.
So in your...
Can you stand up?
Sure. Okay, hi, I'm Ashley. Okay, so in your writing you talk about the organization like shifts more and is focused as the man, as opposed for us, and I think in our age we see the man more as like the cops and the police, but then you talk about how the organizations and business culture is starting to be seen as more of that oppressive force on the counterculture. So what I want
You're talking about the '60s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I read.
Okay.
So regarding the '60s, I just wanted to know what was organization and business scene before that, and how did it start to adopt that whole the man persona to a counterculture? Yeah.
Well, that's a really good question. You know, obviously business is very wary about their public image. So if you go back to the 19th century, you know, they didn't really care, right? It was, you know, you had these enormous private fortunes, Rockefeller, Carnegie, this kind of thing. And then there was a series of, you know, terrible events in the 19th century, strikes, enormous boycotts. You know, it was like industrial war, right? All over. I mean, I lived in Chicago when I was writing that stuff, and Chicago had been the scene of basically class war in the 1890s. There was a huge railroad strike. Chicago's the big railroad hub. Anyhow, that business didn't really care about its public image. Then it wasn't until years later that they figured out they had to start managing this and appearing to be the friend of average people rather than this kind of arrogant oppressor, you know. And they've really gotten good at that. And so you're talking about the 1960s when, and this is something that's true in our own time, business very quickly, you know, figured out that they wanted to identify, or not all business, we shouldn't talk about it as though it was a monolithic thing. There's always divisions, right? There's always divides. But that they wanted to identify with the counterculture in certain ways, not in other ways, right? They weren't going to go out there and protest the war in Vietnam, but like Coca-Cola showing, you know, these people singing that song, I'd like to buy the world a Coke. Don't tell me none of you know this song. None of you have ever heard it. So when I was young, this was like, you know, it was on TV all the time. I'd like to buy the world a Coke. And it was, you know, hippies singing for Coca-Cola. And Pepsi, their eternal rival, had their own, the Pepsi generation, right? And they had their own sort of countercultural anthem. Oh, I forget what it was now, but it's all in The Conquest of Cool. Why do they do this? Well, there's a lot of reasons why they do it. There's a lot of straight up, you know, they want to appeal to the youth market, that sort of thing. But there's also a grander sort of subconscious reason, which is to explain themselves as the friend of mankind rather than the enemy. Perfect example in the news right now, Starbucks. Okay, this is the great gentrifier, you know, of this country, you know. And what is the billionaire CEO of Starbucks doing? He's ordering his employees to go out there and engage people in a conversation about race, which has got to be real uncomfortable for those employees. You know, that's. But what would be really hilarious is if he had told them to go out and engage us in a conversation about social class. Right, and about billionaires. Let's have a conversation about billionaires. Of course, that would never happen. Right. Anyhow, but this goes on all the time. It's I don't know if I answered your question or if I even got at it.
Even though around the early, like turn of the century, 1900s, they decided that we do need to care about public image.
Yes.
Now it's not as much about that anymore. They've already established that we're a friend to people. It's just about how to continue that.
Oh yeah, but but there's so much money is spent on this now.
Yeah.
This is an enormous part of what business is and what they do is this public image. I mean, that's what Madison Avenue is. That's, you know, that's what they, a big part of what they do. I once went to an advertising convention and they handed out a booklet that had something like that 20 things that your advertising should be doing, and only one of them was selling products. All the other things are about your image, and, you know, do you want to do your image this way, your image that way, you know, but there's a million things that they're doing with the images that surround us, in addition to just selling us stuff. By the way, there's other aspects of this. Philanthropy, for example. Carnegie figured out, Carnegie was at one point the richest man in the world, the steel billionaire, and you know, he's rivals with Rockefeller or whatever. Anyhow, he decided that he would give all his money away. He had also been involved in some very brutal strikes. There was a really ugly strike at his factory in Homestead, Pennsylvania. It involved, God, the strikers had cannons and were like blowing things up. I mean, it was crazy. You know, this is in the 19th century. It was the class war. Everybody thought the class war was right around the corner. And Carnegie then gave his entire fortune away. This amazing thing, and built little, you know, cute little public libraries in every small town in America, and made himself into this beloved figure rather than this guy who was out there. And the Rockefellers did the same thing. The Rockefellers had a strike in Colorado that got really bad. People shooting at each other, and the Rockefellers then became enormous philanthropists. And this is, you know, all of the great. Whenever a figure is a great billionaire is, you know, is hated like this, they suddenly become philanthropists. Bill Gates. Bill Gates gave nothing away until, you know, when did they set up the Gates Foundation? Does anybody know? I mean, it was right after the antitrust suit, basically. Once they could see public opinion turning against them, then he became this very generous figure who wants to give everybody a laptop, right? No self-interest in that, no sir. The Koch brothers are interesting. So they're from Wichita. I've never met them, but I know a lot of people who have. You know, when you go there to Wichita, you'd be surprised at how many people have met these guys and know them. And the Koch brothers are fascinating because on the one hand, they do conventional philanthropy, a lot of it, here in New York City. And on the other hand, they do this kind of philanthropy that is barely concealed politics, you know, which is becoming more and more common. You see this in Washington, D.C. You see these philanthropic organizations set up that actually do politics. And so they have this meeting every year, you know, the Koch brothers do, where these other members of their class, these other very, very wealthy industrialists get together and figure out what kind of strategy they're going to take to influence the nation's politics. And they call this a philanthropic exercise. This is about charity. It's about giving, right? So it's a kind of perversion of philanthropy. But it's very similar to what you're describing, you know, shaping public opinion and making business into this beloved friend. Although I don't think anybody really, the Koch brothers, I mean, I wonder if anybody thinks. So I honestly don't, since I've written about the Koch brothers so many times, I have no idea what the public opinion is about them, but I would imagine they're not very popular people, you know. They're not popular? Yeah, yeah. So when I wrote What's the Matter with Kansas, I made fun of them. You know, they weren't they weren't big players like they are now. I mean, they were up there, but they weren't as today they're giving these enormous sums. You know, everywhere you go in Washington is subsidized by these guys. But at the time, it was a much smaller amount. Anyhow, are there any other professors who want to ask?
No, I'm going to chime in real quick. I was wondering, I'm teaching a communication research methods class, and one of the things, and as somebody has to do research as well, one of the things I was wondering if you could talk about is when you've noticed something and you're like, okay, you know, this is interesting, or it's something I'm interested, you know, that I want to write about or learn more about. Can you just give us a quick, quite very basic, you know, what do you do next? So when you know, just what is the step by which you go about finding more information?
Well, I'll tell you, it's it's not a rule, but it's not a rule that I have for myself. But as I go back and look over the stories that I've written in the past year, I always phone. I always wind up, at some point in researching the story, I wind up on the phone with some academic expert on the subject, always. So I just, the other day, I was on the phone with someone who's an expert in mass incarceration and was telling me about, the 94 crime bill, a professor at, I think, Temple University. But this is what, I almost always wind up doing that. It's also, you'd be surprised at how many people are willing to talk to you, even though I'm a known quantity. They know what they're getting into when they talk to me. I'm liberal. I'm going to, tell the story from this aspect. I do opinion writing, but people are still often very willing to talk to you. I like when I wrote The Wrecking Crew, the book I was telling you about corruption in Washington. I talked to Grover Norquist at great length. You know who this is? Grover Norquist. That's funny. 5 years ago, he was like the Koch brothers. Everybody knew who he was. He was this notorious figure. He's the guy that makes politicians sign the pledge that they'll never raise taxes under any circumstances. Interesting guy. Very intelligent guy, by the way. He was happy to talk to me. I talked to Richard Viguerie. Nobody remembers this guy anymore. He was the man who invented direct mail back in the 1970s, also very conservative. But was happy to talk to me, and a really friendly and fascinating man. So it's and it's always you have to get on the phone with people. Basically, is what you have to do. And I also, for Salon, I do a lot of just straight up interviews, just Q&As, and that you have to record it and transcribing it, which is a real headache and takes a long time. And do you guys know something about that? Have you? Yeah.
So the difference for you between journalism and history, you've married the two, basically.
Well, okay. So the kind of journalism that I do, yeah, in some ways they are similar. But okay, but like something when I was writing for the Wall Street Journal, 800 words. There's no time to break any ground there. You do it every week. It all depends on your voice and on your wit. What you bring to the table is not archival research. It's cleverness. It's having a consistent voice that the reader can come back to all the time. And But the one thing that I had that other columnists don't is historical knowledge, right? Because I've read all these goddamn books. Going way, way, way back, and so it's that's the sort of one advantage. It's like I think of my the best columnist working now is Krugman, right? Paul Krugman, and he has a body of specialized knowledge that he draws on, economics, that no other columnist does. There's one guy at the Washington Post, but he's lousy. Okay, Krugman does it, and he does a great job with it. And I like to think that that's sort of what I had, is that I had this knowledge of American history that most journalists did not. And I wouldn't say that's because I went to grad school, though it is. But it's just I've spent my life reading books. I've read way too goddamn many. Yeah.
Stephanie, do you have something?
I know you're a historian, so a lot of your journalism really is based around history. But the kind of journalism for current events, we can't necessarily rely on history. It's more, what's going on today.
Yeah.
So.
Right. Well, I don't write that kind of, the news. I have broken stories, but not. That's not what I'm hired to do. I'm supposed to be reflective. I'm supposed to think about the news of the day, and so I rely on the news journalist to get that story right. But I'm not one of those. I'm sorry to say, because that's a totally different skill set, and sometimes I wish I did that kind of journalism, but then again, when those guys write books, sometimes those books are really bad. Have you ever noticed that? The guys the people that we count on to give us the facts every day, and this is how we know. What do they always say about journalism? It's the first draft of history. Well, those guys, shouldn't be writing here the first draft of history. A lot of them, they're really lousy. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say that. Some of them are really awesome. Some of them are great, But they often they get the emphasis wrong. They misunderstand simple things, you know. But that's what can they have to write it so quickly? Anyhow, I'm thankful to say that's not what I do.
There are a bunch of questions now, which is great, but I'm
Yeah.
going to choose from every class. So Jonathan.
What would you say are the advantages and disadvantages of writing public history, as you described it?
The advantages and disadvantages of public history. Well, the advantage is that people read it. I'm also the big advantage of public history is I'm able to make a living at it, which is kind of a crazy thing when you think about it. And because the idea is you're supposed to be supported by a university somewhere, and then and do your and write as a part of that university. And obviously, I'm not doing that. The disadvantages are. What? I don't have no 401k. Actually, I do, but it's all, I don't belong to an institution. You want to be part of an institution for all sorts of good reasons. It protects you when you run into difficulty. It supports you. There's a lot of reasons that you shouldn't. Everybody shouldn't be every man for himself. In intellectual life. I mean, it's great to have complete freedom and to be able to write whatever I want, and I even use curse words. But it's also, it's scary. What if my next book bombs? What if there's any number of things that could go wrong, and I have nothing to back me up. That's. I'm sure. Wait a second, but you want more of an intellectual answer. You know what it is? Answering to the market is, it's great that I'm able to sell books, but not everybody is. And another thing that makes that makes history. I also have to write about things that are popular. Like writing about current events and writing about politics. Well, it's fortunate that I'm interested in those things, but I'm also kind of not interested in those things. One of my grand ideas is to write a history of creativity, or of ideas about creativity. I'm going to talk about it later in the week. I don't know if a book like that would sell, and I don't know if my book editor would be interested in something like that. When you're in academia, you have the leisure, right, to work in a library for years, to study something, and to go wherever the subject takes you, and probably see it get published. And you're working for a different kind of audience. You're working for readers that are going to come 100 years later, whereas I'm trying to sell books. And I'm sometimes very jealous of academic historians that they have that kind of luxury, that they're able to do that kind of research, travel the world digging in archives. I wish I could do that.
That word, luxury.
Yeah, luxury. I'm sorry, that's the wrong word. Do you think it's a luxury? I think I say that because I'm kind of jealous, and I wish I had that, but I don't want to use it in the sense that Margaret Thatcher used it. Do you remember that? Margaret Thatcher hated academics and cracked down on the British university system in the 80s when you guys were kids. Okay, but there's a famous quote, it might be apocryphal, that's often attributed to Thatcher, where she met some student at one of the big British universities, and the student was studying something really obscure, and Thatcher just shook her head and said, "What a luxury," and then proceeded, of course, to, kill that discipline forever, which is happening in America now. You look at all of these governors all over the country who are saying, we need everyone to study the STEM disciplines. Do you know what STEM disciplines are? Science, tech, engineering, math. And say classics departments. That's always the victim, right? We got to do away with the classics department. We got to do away with the German department. We got to do away with this. We got to do away with that. They're doing this all over America. I loved classics when I was an undergrad. It's my favorite department after history. It's kind of a version of history. Anyhow, I shouldn't say luxury. Did I give you a reasonable answer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, over there in the box.
Well, you already asked one.
Yeah, it's a follow-up. So when we were on the journalist side, and you were talking about how you don't have when you were in your journalist hat, you didn't have the luxury of really, you had the knowledge of context, but you know, because of the speed of it, you can't always go as deep as you would
That's
like to.
exactly right,
So
yes.
my question is, do you feel like that's something that's lacking in journalism today, that context isn't really put into place well enough for readers?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely
And how
lacking,
could we
yeah.
remedy that?
Okay, so I told you how can we remedy it? Well,
And you know,
I got news for you. Everything is going the other direction. We're not remedying anything in this country. Everything's getting worse. I'm sorry, I'm a born pessimist. But so I wrote about, I told you, I'm fascinated by the Clinton years. I'm kind of done with it now, but for a while, I went to the Clinton Library and I wrote it up for Salon.com. And now, in retrospect, I did kind of a lousy job. I didn't really nail it the way I should have. It's a story that I was really excited about when I started working on it, but I didn't really, now in retrospect, I think it's not one of my favorite stories that I wrote. I wish I had read all these books about Clinton and had interviewed all of these, sources that know everything there is to know about Clinton and all that sort of thing, and then written the story. But I didn't have the time for that. And when I say I'm afraid everything's going the other direction, you look at the way the internet is pushing journalism. And so, like I said, I wrote for Harper's Magazine for many years, and I loved writing for Harper's Magazine. Everything's so carefully written and so polished, fact-checked, beautiful prose. I was so proud of everything I wrote there. But I'm afraid that is that model of journalistic practice is disappearing before our eyes. That the internet is that's probably going to go away at some point. Not Harper's themselves. I think they'll probably last for a long time, but it's becoming more rare to see something like this. Yes.
I'm a professor from college, and I like your work very much. And I actually think there are a lot of journalists who have written fabulous histories. I think of Adam Hochschild, who did King Leopold.
Oh yeah, that was a good one. Yeah.
Isabel Wilkerson, and one of my favorites is Gail Collins. And at her book party, when she did the book about the women's liberation movement, she made a big point to thank her 10 research assistants.
Oh my God.
Now, this is my question.
10?
Yes. Now, Gail Collins, if you don't know, and you should, she writes for the New York Times. She's very witty, and even in the most miserable of moments, if you read one of her columns, you will just chuckle. You will.
Yeah. No. We're right here in New York City. They know who she is.
I'm just saying, just in case. But my question is, teasingly, do you have research assistants? And how common is it among those journalists who are able to write these kind of books? I mean, Doris Kearns Goodwin got in a lot of trouble because she a little bit too liberally borrowed, plagiarized, stole from other people's readings.
Yeah.
And I'm sure a lot of it had to do with not being on top of all her research assistants.
Ooh. Well, I've never had. I mean, we all, I try to put things in quotation marks. It's important to me if I'm, borrowing something. And often, even if I'm just using the same idea, I'll often acknowledge where I got it from in a footnote. No. Right. Is it a problem? I do have a research assistant, and I expect him to, he's not here today, but he'll be here later on in the week because he lives here in New York. And when did I first start getting research? I had one for... I think I had one for What's the Matter with Kansas, but I've never been a big user of research assistants. I like to. I'll tell you something. We were talking earlier about what I regret about not being an academic historian. I used to love spending time in libraries. I just love it. University of Chicago, where I went to graduate school, has this OpenStax library. Do they have that here? Where you just go in and you wander around, and I would go in there, and it's like I would lose track of time almost immediately, and you couldn't get me out of there. I loved it, and I really missed that, and so I love doing research, and I'm taking time off from Salon right now to write a book, and I just love doing the research. The problem is, of course, you go down the rabbit hole, and you follow a subject where you should just, like, the journalist in me says, Stop now. No one cares. Oh.
There's time for one more. Okay. Any others? Yeah, Kay, go for it.
So, I heard you use the word bias and that you write bias histories. And as history students, we're taught that like bias is basically Satan.
Yeah.
So how do you equate the two, and is it easier with public history? And there's also this stigma that writing biased public history is considered really unprofessional. Would you think that?
Well, when I was a graduate student, what was that book called? Do you remember this book? It's called That Noble Dream. Do you remember that? That was a professor at University of Chicago wrote this book about the impossibility of objectivity, about the chase for objectivity among historians, and the ultimate impossibility of ever achieving it. But we all think that objectivity is the place to be. And I basically started out by saying, well, I have a viewpoint, and here's what it is. Now, with my first book, The Conquest of Cool, it's different. It's written in a very different voice, and when I say I have a bias, look, I'm an opinion writer now. Of course I have a point of view. But when I started out, no, I was definitely trying to be less judgmental. By the way, I say I have a bias, but at the same time, so much of what I do involves calling people who I don't agree with and quoting them accurately and being fair to them, even though my conclusions are probably going to be different, or even though my starting point is very different from theirs. That's just what I do. I mean, I spent years writing about conservatism. I'm fascinated by conservative. When I was young, I was a Republican. Okay, when I was in high school, and I really thought Ronald Reagan was awesome. And so that's why I'm fascinated by conservatism. But if you're fascinated by conservatism and you want to write about conservatism, by God, you got to talk to conservatives and you got to see what makes them tick. And for them to talk to you, they have to have some faith that you're going to quote them fairly and you're going to play fair with them. And I think I've always done that. I don't quote people out of context. I don't, like I said earlier, I spent some time with Grover Norquist and quoted him at great length, saying sort of fascinating, sort of scary things. But he knew what I was up to, and he said those things, and they're in the book. So bias, yeah, but not like. I have a point of view, but at the same time, I try to be fair as an individual. Mr. Viscusi.
The thing that strikes me is that this dialogue between history and journalism and various kinds of history it's interesting, but it doesn't seem to quite touch what you're doing, to me anyway. It seems to me that you have a gift or weakness or an instinct for the blind spot, like the Wrecking Crew is a good example of that. The Bush administration had very few surprises to offer. Everything that they did, they advertised in advance, during, and after, but nobody wanted to notice. And you really nailed it. And I'm sure that when you talk to Grover Norquist and people like that, even though they know you don't agree with them, they are incredibly grateful for the level of attention that you provide, because I think that those people get overlooked because what they're doing is so horrible that even the people who support it don't really want to know about it. So that what you're doing, in my mind, amounts really almost to prophecy in the old fashion.
Oh, come on now.
No, I don't mean prophecy in prophesying the future.
You mean like the Jeremiah thing?
I mean telling the truth about things that other people don't want to say. I think that What's the Matter with Kansas was a book like that.
Well, that's nice of you. That's nice of you to say that. That is what I try to do. I don't know if I've succeeded or not, but that's totally what I aim for. And like I said, I'm working on a project now about the Democrats. If there ever was a blind spot in our political discourse, I've come to believe it's talking about these guys. People like me, who are supposed to be progressives or liberals or on the left or whatever you want to call it, are not supposed to criticize Democrats. Why not? Because that's to open the gates to the barbarian horde. To Ted Cruz and company are going to come streaming through and wreck everything, which I've said many times, yes, that's what they want to do. But that shouldn't get Democrats off the hook. That shouldn't just be a way to exempt one of the two parties in the two-party system from scrutiny. And yet that's what's happened. So you've got this, this core of very smart journalists out there, the people that I work with at Salon, the people that I work with at Harper's, the people that I've worked with throughout my career, who are reluctant to criticize Democrats or to look into. There's also plenty of people who share my point of view, as you might imagine. So I shouldn't say, I'm sorry, that was the wrong way to put it. But anyhow, this is the biggest blind spot of them all for our side. We are, like I say, I'm looking back at the Clinton administration and finding terrible, terrible things. And they're not secret. Everybody knows he proposed and signed the 1994 crime bill. This is not a secret. It's only when you decide that you're going to scrutinize this with the same level of attention that you scrutinize, say, the doings of the Bush administration, that it becomes clear, So yeah, that's what I aim for. I'm glad that you think I've achieved it to some degree.
Well, certainly sometimes.
I think that's all the time we have for, so let's thank Mr. Franklin. Programs that have all the other events in them, so you can hear and speak about different topics from different points of view and different angles.
I just want to give a shout out on the program list that you have, that Mr. Frank's big lecture is on Against Creativity on Wednesday.
Yeah,
and
you're going to like that one. It's funny. There's no slides, though. No slides. Sorry.
And then on Thursday, we get to hear him have a dialogue with Paul Krugman at 12:30 p.m. So
Tell them where.
12:30 p.m. in Whitman Auditorium, in Whitman Hall. Okay, so that should be fun. So thank you for coming today, and I hope to see you at some of the other events. And thank you.